Everyone, Kevin from Total Endurance here. Just starting to put together some of the kind of data from the run testing. Just thought we'd kind of highlight some of the findings. Certainly not got through it all yet. The biggest one's taking the most time is kind of the biomechanical data, just because there's so much data for every single runner that it's hard to kind of quantify and showcase some of the differences yet. So certainly working on that, hopefully get some things around that. There is definitely some trends that we're seeing, but yeah, I haven't quite finished that. But anyways, just wanted to kind of put together something about running economy and just showcasing some of the differences between the different runners, what it tells us, how we can potentially improve it, and yeah, just some kind of interesting data from that. So first of all, running economy, what is it? Easiest way to think about it is it's how efficient you are at converting the oxygen you're consuming into mechanical work. So basically, the more efficient you are, the less oxygen that's needed to run at a given velocity. So if you think of it like a car, it's the amount of, or how efficient that car is. So it's how much fuel it's going to need to travel a certain distance. The less fuel it needs, the more efficient it's going to be. The better it's going to do as the distances go longer, certainly when you're limited on kind of fuel usage. It can be expressed as the amount of oxygen needed to run a given velocity, generally in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. So that is the rate of oxygen usage. So you'll often see things like that, things like when you speak about VO2 max being the maximum number of oxygen you can take in. So that's usually per kilogram per minute. And the reason that that's kind of done is mainly so that you can compare like for like with the runners, so that a bigger runner will tend, as in terms of mass, will tend to have higher oxygen uptake, so it'll take more oxygen, but when you divide that by the body's got to circulate that through a bigger mass, they get kind of lower numbers or kind of have similar numbers. But basically what you want to look at that is, well, how much oxygen should it take to run at a given speed? And from this we get this kind of calculation. It's a fairly standard calculation to calculate the theoretical metabolic demand of running. Now, like all calculations, it's not perfect, but it's certainly holds relatively true, I think, for the most part. And I've put the kind of formula down there just to show how that's calculated. It's basically the amount of oxygen needed to run horizontally and the amount of oxygen needed to overcome gravity plus 3.5, which is the amount of oxygen needed at rest, just kind of all that summed together. And it gives us this, so we basically take account how fast they're running, and it gives us how much oxygen is theoretically needed to run that pace. And the key thing with this thing to note is that it needs to be, or it's only valid under steady state conditions. It doesn't work quite as well under like VO2 max testing, although we have found that the trend is quite similar and it does seem to hold quite well for that. So it's quite a good guide to showcase a little bit of efficiency, but generally the steady state data is going to be more relevant for that. But basically this blue line is tracking how much oxygen is theoretically needed to run at the velocities that are down below, and those velocities are the range of the paces that we tested across everybody. So the slowest runners kind of did 7:30 per k pace, and the fastest runners got up to 19k an hour. So there's obviously quite a big range within that, but kind of shows the amount of oxygen theoretically needed and how much actually is needed here. So this now takes the average oxygen consumption from the test data that we got from everyone against that theoretical demand for oxygen. So what you tend to see here is at the lower speeds, the runners were meeting the demand, whereas as you got faster, the need for oxygen was less. So the runners were better at converting the oxygen into mechanical work, meaning that they could run at the same speed for less theoretical oxygen, for less oxygen that's theoretically needed. And that's something that or certainly one of the things we've seen is the faster runners are more efficient overall, generally speaking. And it was just quite a nice way to kind of showcase that, and it shows that we tend to see that. And again, as you see, as we start to go faster, so if you kind of look here, to run 19 kilometers an hour, you theoretically need to have very good efficiency, or you need to have a VO2 max somewhere in the 70s. Now, if you want to go faster than that, you're going to need a higher VO2 max, and it does get to a point why sometimes we're limited by that. So even if you've got quite a good VO2 max, is if you're also not very efficient, you can mean that you need to use more of your oxygen to just get that speed. Likewise, some people are very efficient, which means they don't need to have as high VO2 max. And I'm going to do something on VO2 max certainly in the coming weeks to kind of showcase some of that data as well. But now what we want to look at more, probably what's interesting, is if we then look at what often running economy is measured in, is milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per kilometer. So that's now taking account of how much oxygen the runner is using but then also converting that into how much oxygen they need to run a kilometre. So you can compare different runners at different speeds relative to that number, because it doesn't tend to change. So it does go up and down, but it's fairly linear for most runners. Is that if you're running at a certain speed, you cover the distance in a certain time. As you go faster, yes, you need more oxygen, but you're also covering the distance at a faster speed as well. So generally it should, in most cases, be fairly similar across all speeds for a given runner. That is not for everybody. But just to kind of show what that kind of means and how that kind of works out, two runners, let's just say they're running 10 kilometers an hour, and this is not actually from the data, this is just to kind of showcase the info and where it comes from. But if you're running 6 minutes a kilometer, you're going to take 6 minutes to run 1 kilometer. Let's just say runner 1 requires 40 milliliters of oxygen, so that's 40 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute to run 6 minute K pace. Whereas runner 2, slightly more efficient, they only need 35 milliliters of oxygen too. Now, you can see straight away that runner 2 is more efficient, just because they need less oxygen for the same speed. But runner 1 will have runner 1 has a running economy of 240 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per kilometer. So that's basically taking the 40, multiplying it by 6, gives you 240 milliliters of oxygen. Whereas runner 2 will have slightly better running economy, so they're taking 35 milliliters of oxygen multiplied by 6, gives us 210 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per kilometer. So that's about a 13-14% difference between the two runners for the same speed. So that runner 2 is about 12-13% more efficient than runner 1 at the same speed. Now, obviously, that's can change, and there's a lot of data that can kind of vary in that, but it's just an interesting kind of note, and it does tell us that runner 2 we would expect to be more efficient and probably do better as the distances go longer. Not always, but relatively speaking. We put this in just to kind of show the categories that we use to categorize it. Generally, anything over 260 milliliters we would say is quite poor and kind of needs work. Anything sort of between 240 to 260 is generally below average, so you're kind of runner 1 is somewhere in that average, below average. Average 210 to 240, good is anything from about 200 to 210, and anything under 200 is generally considered very good, and certainly a strength if someone's running economy is that good. But what does that look like across the people we tested? So you can kind of see here again the trend, just put the trend line there for people to see that as the runners went faster, they tended to get more efficient. So the runners tend to see that as the people who got to faster speeds tended to need less oxygen to do that overall in terms of running economy, whereas your slower runners are less efficient. They're using more theoretical oxygen for relatively slower speeds. Yeah, and I think that's probably the key standout from that, is that faster runners generally are more efficient. But if we take those kind of categories that we did and then basically put that scatter graph on top of that, we can kind of see what that looks like. So in terms of running economy, so again you can see pretty clearly that your running economy tends to trend better with the faster running velocities. Now obviously there is variance in that, so you've got some runners running at 10k an hour where they've got pretty good running economy, and some people with very poor running economy. Now if you were to take those two runners, if I didn't know anything about those runners other than this data here, that this runner here is using 270 milliliters of oxygen, and the other runner is using, just to show where that is, yeah, so you've got here one of the runners running at about 180 milliliters of oxygen, whereas this runner up here is using 270 milliliters of oxygen. All I need to know from, or what I get from that, is that runner at the bottom is going to be a better endurance runner all day of the week. Runner up here is going to need to improve running economy, and they're also going to burn through a lot of oxygen, probably going to burn more carbohydrate, partly because of that as well. But yeah, it's quite interesting just to see that. But if we look at just taking account of like poor running economy, so taking these kind of numbers in here and put that against their metabolic demand graph from earlier, what you get is this. So you can see that the blue line again is the theoretical demand for oxygen. It's the same as the graph previously, just taking the velocities for this particular runner. So the amount of oxygen they need exceeds that number. Now, this is something that I became quite interested in a wee while back, mainly because this is very similar to what my graph looks like, in that this particular runner and myself, we use more oxygen than is theoretically needed, meaning that we waste a lot of oxygen. So it's like, imagine that you've got your miles per gallon on your car. That's how far it should theoretically be traveled on that tank of fuel, but you're only getting half that because the fuel's going somewhere else. It's being used to, whatever, keep you warm. Generally, you'll find there'll be people with more muscle mass as well, but it means that their running economy is going to be quite poor. It means that they're going to rely on using more oxygen, which is good or okay if they can, if they have a high VO2 max, they can get a lot of oxygen in. But at some point, it's going to be an issue. Certainly, as the distances go longer, those type of runners are going to struggle, mainly because of their efficiency. They're too inefficient, and the longer they get, the worse that gets. Whereas conversely to that, a runner who's a lot more efficient, so this is probably the most efficient runner we tested. So again, the metabolic demand, pace is slightly faster along the bottom. The blue line still tracks the same, it hasn't changed. Then the amount of oxygen they need to run those paces, so there's a big gap between the blue and the red here, mainly because that runner needs a lot less oxygen than is theoretically expected. So their body is very, very efficient at converting that into mechanical work. So you take this runner, I'd anticipate this runner will do very well as the distances go longer. They are very, very efficient for that. Obviously there's other factors that play into that, but generally speaking, from a running economy factor, they are an efficient runner. Now, what we want to look at is what happens when you get two runners who are both with very good running economy. So again, both of these runners here are under 200 milliliters of oxygen, so I would put them definitely into the very good running economy category, just on this data. So runner 1, that's the same runner from the previous graph, 166 milliliters of oxygen, 171, 168. So on average, they're about 170 milliliters of oxygen to run 4 kilometers an hour, 4 minutes per kilometer, which is 4 minutes kilometers, which is 15 kilometers per hour, up to 17 kilometers per hour. Whereas runner 2, we see needs a lot more oxygen to run those speeds, or is using a little bit more oxygen to run those speeds. But they're both good. So when we look at that, on theory, we would expect that runner 1 is a better runner because runner 1 is more efficient, and efficiency is good. Now again, these are two very efficient runners, so it's basically comparing a very, very efficient runner to a very efficient runner. But what we're interested in is, well, how much of their max are they using? So that states that they're very efficient, but also how much of their capacity do they need to run those speeds? And that tells us obviously another story. If we go to here, which is something called your fractional utilization of VO2 max. So if we start at 4 minutes per kilometer, so again 15 kilometers per hour, runner 1 is working at about 85% of their VO2 max. So they're probably just below their threshold, whereas runner 2, despite using more oxygen in terms of running economy, they're only working at like 55% of their max, so they're pretty much low zone 2. They're cruising, they're not even trying. Their breathing rate is really low, they could still hold a conversation relative to the same person running at the same speed. And then as you go faster, obviously it increases, but at sort of 3:30 pace, which was 17k an hour, runner 1 is pretty close to VO2 max. They don't have much room to grow it now. They're kind of already pretty close to the maximum maximum oxygen uptake, whereas runner 2 is roughly 75%, and for most people that's about, sort of good runners, that's about marathon pace. So we'd expect runner 2 to be capable of running in the kind of 2:30 kind of marathon targets, where runner 1 is definitely not going to do that. They're probably going to be, probably just below 4 minutes per k pace, mainly because of the fractional utilization. But they are efficient, so they do get away with it maybe more than others. But you don't see that by just looking at running economy. You see that by obviously looking at how much of their max, that's how hard, the intensity of which they're working at. And the thing I think just stands out with some of the VO2 max, now I'd probably say from some of the testing data that we got, that runner 1 and a couple of other runners probably aren't getting a true VO2 max. So what often happens, and again this is maybe for another talk, but I'll just summarize it a little bit, is that as runners started to get faster, so the need for stride length increases, the stride rate starts to go up, but you get to a point for most runners where if they can't apply enough force to the back, so their rear legs, using glutes, things like that, if they can't apply enough force, they can't travel far enough in that stride to meet the speed of the treadmill or hit that speed. And obviously to do that, they'll run faster and faster, they'll turn their legs over faster, but they get to a point where they just can't turn their legs over any faster, and that's what limits them, that's what stops them. And we've seen that with a couple of runners, is that they're able to run at a really high percentage of VO2 max, so the threshold is really close to VO2 max, mainly because VO2 max isn't true reflection of what they could do. So their body is not at absolute maximum, it's a maximum effort, but their body still could take in more oxygen if their legs would allow them. Basically thinking of, again, like your car analogy, the engine's strong, the engine's comfortable, the engine's working comfortably, but the problem is the chassis won't hold up to it. The chassis starts to rattle, the chassis starts to kind of struggle to maintain that, and it's maybe where the strength conditioning factor comes in. They need to get a little bit stronger. And maybe just as well, they haven't done enough of it. They haven't done much speed stuff. They tend to go out and run lots of miles from that. But anyways, that's another discussion to be had. In terms of running economy, just to kind of summarize kind of the key things. So there's several factors influence it, probably 6 main ones. Biomechanics, which is the big thing I want to kind of try and decipher and figure out what are the factors that contribute to that. One of the things that definitely stands out from the data that we've got so far with the biomechanics, flight ratio, which is the ratio of time spent in the air relative to time spent in the ground. So your faster runners are displaying higher flight ratios relative to slower runners at the same speed. Now obviously there again gets the point, so basically they're spending more time in the air relative to time on the ground even at the same speed, which is quite interesting. Again, what contributes to that is a couple of factors, but we want to get into kind of that a bit more detail as well. But again, anyway, your biomechanics, the more efficient your movement is, basically the more rebound you're going to get back from the ground, the better you're going to have running, or the better running economy is going to have. Muscle fiber type, if you have lots of slow twitch muscle fibers, your running economy is going to be better because those slow twitch muscle fibers are much more efficient at using oxygen, whereas fast twitch muscle fibers are less efficient. And it's one of the things you tend to find if you do a long endurance ride, or run, sorry, if you're starting to feel your legs start to get really heavy, one of the factors that is contributing to that is that your fast twitch muscle fibers are starting to fatigue, slow twitch muscle fibers are starting to fatigue, and you're starting to rely more on fast twitch muscle fibers, and they're just not very efficient, which is partly why you see you'll have to start to slow down. So generally one of the things you want to do with training, or what you're trying to do with training, is you're trying to reduce the usage of your fast twitch muscle fibers and increase the use of your slow twitch muscle fibers and get more efficient from your slow twitch muscle fibers. Now that's not something you can actively in terms of quantify, but it definitely does mean that the more fast twitch muscle fibers, the more muscle mass you have, the worse your running economy is generally going to be. Training, again, that comes back to training, is that the more training you do relative to your discipline or your event, the more efficient you're going to get at it. But you can also do things like strength training, so the muscles get stronger, which means that they fatigue less. Plyometrics also improves running economy because that means that you hit the ground and you travel further, so you bounce, the tendons are more elastic. Running drills, that's helped to improve mechanics from all that. Also the type of training you do, how fast you do your fast running, how slow you do your slow running, that all factors in the intensity at which you're training. Shoes and surface, the surface was the same for everyone, so it doesn't necessarily change anything for the data we've got, but running on different surfaces will impact your running economy. Running shoe does make a big difference as well. Still quite a lot of studies on various things on that. Certainly carbon shoes now will help your running economy, mainly because that stiffness is going to help you bounce off the ground better. So you load that effective spring on the shoe up and you get more bounce back from it, so you're traveling further for the same amount of your physical use, because the shoes keep doing some of that. Body composition, generally speaking, the more efficient you are, you'll probably have lower mean mass, you'll carry less body fat, because obviously more weight means more oxygen is needed to carry that weight. Some people you can improve some of that, not always, so you've got to be cautious with that. Also age and experience as well. Generally speaking, the more running you've done, the more efficient you're going to be. As we get older, you tend to be more efficient, and it's harder to improve maybe that explosiveness, but if you can maintain that explosiveness and you can build up that efficiency over time, you're also going to see good improvements running economy. One of the things that probably does stand out, I think it's probably true, your better runners tend to do more running from that, so they travel further per stride, but they're also traveling further in a session, which allows them to gradually build up accumulation of miles. But why? Often if you do the right intensity at the right time, you can improve quite a lot, and you get more efficient from that, from doing the kind of steady runs at the steady intensity rather than doing them too hard. Anyways, that's a specific thing for depending on the individual, but hopefully people got some interest from that. Hopefully there's some kind of useful information. Feel free to ask us any questions if you're not sure or would like to know more info, and hopefully I'll get some other of these kind of notes put together to kind of discuss as well. But yeah, if anybody's got anything they'd like to know or anything they'd be really interested in finding out more, please just get in touch. Yeah, and hopefully chat to you soon, and thanks for listening.